the wave of darker emotions as he considered what creatures such as these had done to his world. The goblin called out again. It was time to answer, he knew, and since he had no idea what the goblin was saying, he merely stood up tall, too tall to be any goblin, and slowly dropped back the hood of his cloak. Half of the goblin party shrieked. The spear wielder accompanied its yell by rushing 3 strides forward and hurling its weapon. Elbryn waited until the last possible moment, then flashed Hawkwing across in front of him, deflecting the spear. He moved the bow around and out as it connected, diverting, then defeating the spear's momentum, turning it harmlessly in midair, and then catching it mid-shaft in his right hand, as his left brought Hawkwing back to his side. Suddenly, he held the spear, aimed right back at its original wielder. That stopped the goblins cold before they could even begin to charge. Emotions churned confusingly in the young man. He remembered the teaching of the elves, mostly of tolerance, though they held no love for goblin kind or for any of the Fomorian races. However, Elbryn was not in any human settlement, not in any land claimed by his kind, and quite possibly was within the boundaries of goblin territory. If that was the case, would he be justified in waging battle with these 6? Yet, one had just attacked him, though it might have come more from fear than aggression, and Elbryn, whatever logical reasoning he summoned, could not possibly dismiss those memories of Dundalis. He hesitated. Were these goblins responsible for what their kin had done to Elbryn's home? The one the elves had named Nightbird had to give himself an honest answer. He owed that much, at least, to Bellamar Jaraviel. A flick of his powerful wrist sent the spear flying back the way it had come, to land with a splash and stick up from the stream just a foot or so in front of the creature who had thrown it. Elbryn cast a warning glance the goblin's way, then turned sideways to them, focusing on the water, and bent down to finish filling his water skin. He had given them one chance. A large part of him, that boy who remembered Dundalis, hoped they would not take it. He heard and felt the water stirring as the creatures came on slowly. He sensed that at least 2 had broken away, moving out of the stream to flank him front and back. Elbryn measured their approach, kept wary for any hint that the spear was coming his way once more. Everything seemed to stop, all movement, all splashing. The creatures were not more than 10 feet away, he knew. Slowly, he turned square with the main group of 4, rising to stand straight, a foot and more higher than his tallest foe. "Inagash!" the closest and ugliest of the group demanded, holding forth its sword, a 2-foot blade not unlike the one Olwen had given Elbryn for his patrols. "I do not understand," he replied evenly. The goblins muttered something among themselves. Elbryn realized that they could not understand his language either. Then the ugly one turned back to him. "Inegas!" it said more forcefully, and it pointed its sword at the staff, then at the riverbank. "I hardly think so," Elbryn replied, smiling widely and shaking his head. In a barely noticeable movement, the ranger pulled the feathered tip from the bow, tucking it and the bowstring into his belt. The goblin gave a threatening growl. Elbryn shook his head again. The creature rushed to close half the distance and prodded with its sword, a movement more of intimidation than an actual attack. But it was the creature who was surprised. Elbryn grabbed the staff, right hand over left, reversed his grip with his left as the pole started moving, and snapped it across so quickly in front of him that the goblin never had a chance to move. The staff connected simultaneously on the sword and the goblin's hand, knocking the weapon from the creature's grasp and launching it a dozen feet away. A subtle shift, still too quick for the creature to dodge, and Elbryn stabbed the tapered end out straight, striking the goblin on its sloping forehead, right above and between the eyes, laying it out straight in the stream. With a whoop of delight, the other goblins, predictably, came on. Elbrian brought his staff back in, letting go with his left hand, flipping with his right to send the forward tip under. Never breaking the momentum, he extended his right arm out, catching the closing goblin, the one that had run out of the stream to flank the man, completely by surprise, Hawkwing's tip stabbing right under its chin. Back in came the weapon, a full and defensive spin between the ranger and the three goblins coming along in the stream. Elbrian caught the staff firmly in his left hand and extended that arm out in similar fashion so that the other flanking goblin was poked away. Back in came the staff, half spun and caught again in the right hand. Half spun, angled outward diagonally, and caught again in the left. And then the right hand catching it too, as the trailing end came around and over. Elbrian shifting the weapon's angle and striding boldly ahead. The downward chop connected squarely on the head of the center goblin, the spear wielder, Hawkwing's incredible hardness splitting wide the creature's skull with a resounding crack. Elbrian swept his staff out to the left, knocking aside the club strike, then back to the right, parrying the sword. Back left, back right, each time the angle shifting to defeat the intended attack. Then back left, then left again, knocking wide the creature's club arm. Elbrian stepped left as well and spun, avoiding an awkward cut of its sword. He came around hard and low, Hawkwing flying before him. The goblin, to its credit, recognized the circuitous attack and managed to get its club down. But Elbrian merely lifted Hawkwing's flying tip, cracking across the creature's skinny forearm, shattering bone. The club fell into the stream. The goblin shrieked and clutched at its arm. Elbrian stepped forward, facing the creature squarely, staff coming horizontal in front of him, and punched out with his left, right, left, Hawkwing swishing about to smack the goblin hard on alternate sides of its head. The ranger dropped his right foot back after the last strike, retracting the staff, then turned sidelong to his current foe, expecting an attack from the sword wielder. Seeing that creature in full flight, Elbrian stabbed the staff back out hard to his left, hitting the dazed and battered goblin right in the face. He didn't see, but heard the movement, as the goblin that had come in at his left struggled to its feet. Hawkwing went swinging again, turning a vertical circle under and then over Elbrian's right shoulder as he turned and leaped out to the left. Down raced the staff above the angle of the terrified goblin's pitiful attempt to parry, crashing hard against the base of the creature's neck. The goblin jolted perfectly still, and then, as if the wave of energy had rolled right down to its feet and then come rushing back up, the creature went into a weird, backward leap, landing on its feet for a long moment, then slowly falling over. Elbrian turned and dropped into a defensive crouch, but no enemies presented themselves. The first one he had hit, the leader, was on its hands and knees in the middle of the stream, facing away, too dazed to even get back to its feet. The one he had hit to the right of the stream was still on the ground, squirming and gasping for air that would hardly come. This last one he had hit was surely dead, as was the spear wielder. The one who had taken 4 blows to the head lay unmoving at the stream's edge, its face in the water. The last of the group, the one with the sword, faced Elbrian from 20 paces, hopping up and down, hurling curses that the ranger did not understand. Casually, in no hurry, Elbrian replaced the feathered tip of his bow, and in one fluid motion bent the staff around his leg and hooked the bowstring over the bottom edge. The goblin caught on, howled, and fled. Up came Hawkwing, 3 feathers separated, clear and straight for 35 feet. The arrow slammed the goblin square in the back, lifting it clear of the stream and sending it another 5 feet. Arms and legs flailing, it flopped heavily, face down in the water. Grim Elbrian retrieved the axe from the side of his pack and finished the task at hand. Then he was on his way, running across the moorland. Part 3. Conflict. Did you go home, Uncle Martha, when you walked away from under Blau Innernis, from your elfin home? Did you return to the place you had known in your childhood? I had thought it a vision that led me across the moorlands then, north to a
Hey,
sleeping
USA,
vale
how
of
you doing?
knee-deep caribou moss and stark
It
pines.
wasn't too bad.
Now I wonder
Went
if it
out and
wasn't
ate with
merely a memory returned, a
my mom
backtracking
took
of
me
the
and my
same
brother
course
out
the
to
elves
eat,
had
so I
taken on
guess it
that
wasn't
day
too bad.
when they pulled me from Dundalis. Perhaps they then placed a veil over my memory, that I had no desire to escape Caer Alfar and run back to the place of my kinfolk. Perhaps that last oracle
So I guess I
under
can't
Blau
complain too
Innernis
much.
was
Had a good
no more than a lifting
dinner.
of the veil. I had not even considered this until my northern trek led me back to these lands familiar. I feared that I had erred in my course, that I had returned home by memory, not by vision. Now I understand. This land is my land, my ranger haunt. It is under my protection, though the proud and hardy folk here would hardly believe they need it, and certainly would refuse it should I ask. They are more numerous than when I lived here last. Weedy Meadow remains a village of 80. The goblins never attacked after the sacking of Dundalis, and a
Right.
new village, nearly twice
Give me
that in
1
number, has
second
been
and
built some
I'll
30
roll
miles
one
to the
up.
west,
Oh, a
even
couple up.
further into the wilder lands. End of the world, they call it, and a fitting name, it seems. And Uncle Martha, they have rebuilt Dundalis, and have kept its name. I do not yet understand how I feel about this. Is the new Dundalis a tribute to the last, or a mockery? It pained me when, walking along the wide cart path, I happened upon a signpost, a new signpost, for we never had such things, proclaiming the village limits, the edge of Dundalis. For a moment, I admit, I even held fast to fantasy that my memory of the destruction, of the carnage, was in error. Perhaps, I dare to think, the elves have tricked me into believing that Dundalis and all its folk had died, to keep me from fleeing their custody, or from wanting to flee. Under the name on the signpost, someone had scrawled, Dundalis Gan Dundalis. And under that, another prankster had added, Mac Dundalis, both indications that this place was the son of Dundalis. I should have understood the implication. It was with great anticipation that I walked that last mile to the village proper, to see a place that I knew not. There is a tavern now, larger than the old common house and built on the foundation of my old home, built by strangers. It was such an awkward moment, Uncle Martha, a feeling of absolute displacement. I had come home, and yet this was not my home. The people were much the same, strong and firm, tough as the deepest winter night, and yet they were not the same. No Brodie Gentle, no Bunker Cryer, no Shane McMichael, no Thomas Ault, no mother and father, no pony, no Dundalis. I refused the invitation of the tavern's proprietor, a jolly-looking man, and, without a word, I suppose that was the moment the folk of the village began to suspect that I was a bit unusual, headed back the way I'd come. I took my frustrations out on the signpost, I admit, tearing off the lowest board, the scribbled references to the original village. Never had I felt so alone, not even that morning after the disaster. The world had moved on without me. I meant to come and speak with you then, Uncle Martha, and so I crossed by the town up the slope on the northern edge. There are several small caves on the back side of that slope, overlooking the wide vale. In one of those, so I believed, I would find Oracle. I would find Uncle Martha. I would find peace. I never made it over that ridge. It is a funny thing, memory. To the elves, it is a way to walk backward in time, to rediscover old scenes from the perspective of new enlightenments. So it was that morning, on the ridge north of Dundalis. I saw her, Uncle Martha, my pony, as alive to me as ever she was, as wonderful and beautiful. I remembered her so vividly that she was indeed beside me once again, for a few fleeting moments. I have no new friends among the current residents of Dundalis, and in truth I expect none, but I have found peace, Uncle Martha. I have come home. Elbrian Wyndham. Chapter 23. The Black Bear. It came roaring down that hill, the man was saying, waving his arm frantically in the direction of the forested slope north of Dundalis. I got my family into the root cellar. Damned glad I dug the thing. The speaker was about his own age, the ranger noticed, as he approached the group of 10, 8 men and 2 women, who were gathered outside the nearly destroyed cabin on the outskirts of Dundalis. Damn big bear, one of the other men said. 12-footer, the first man, the victim of the attack, remarked, holding his arms as far apart as he could possibly stretch. Brown? Elbrian asked, though the question was merely a formality, for a 12-foot-tall bear would have to be brown. The group turned as one to regard the stranger. They had seen Elbrian about town on several occasions over the last few months, mostly sitting quietly in the tavern, the Howling Sheila. But none, save Belster O'Cumley, the innkeeper, had spoken a word to the suspicious man. Their reluctance was clearly etched on their faces as they regarded the outsider and his unusual dress, the forest green cloak and the triangular cap. Black, the victim corrected evenly, his eyes narrowed. Elbrian nodded, accepting that as more likely the truth than the man's previous statement. He knew 2 things from the color. First, that the man was surely exaggerating the bear's size, and second, that this attack was far from normal. A brown bear might come roaring down the hill, hurling itself upon the cabin as if the shelter were some elk. But black bears were shy creatures by nature, far from aggressive, unless cornered or defending their cubs. What business is it of yours? Another man asked, his tone making it seem to Elbrian as if he were being accused of the attack. Ignoring the comment, the ranger walked past the group and knelt low, inspecting a set of tracks. As he suspected, the bear was nowhere near the size the excited farmer was claiming, probably closer to 5 or 6 feet in height, perhaps 200 to 300 pounds. Elbrian didn't really begrudge the man his excitement, though. A 6-foot bear could indeed appear twice that height when angered, and the amount of damage to the house was remarkable. We cannot tolerate a rogue, a large man, tall Eugenik insisted. Elbrian looked up to regard him. He was broad-shouldered and strong, forceful in manner as he was in speech. His face was clean-shaven, seeming almost babyish, but anyone looking at powerful tall knew that to be a deceptive facade. Elbrian noticed the man's hands, for hands were often the most telling of all, were rough and thick with calluses. He was a worker, a true frontiersman. We'll get together a group and go out and kill the damned thing, he said, and he spat upon the ground. Elbrian was surprised that the burly man hadn't decided to go out alone and hunt the bear. And what of you? The man bellowed, looking at the ranger. You were asked what business this might be of yours, but of yet I've heard no answer. Toll moved closer to the stooping ranger as he spoke. Elbrian came up to his full height. He was as tall as the man, and, while not as heavy, certainly more muscular. Do you think that you belong in Dundalis? The man asked bluntly, again the word sounding like an accusation or a threat. Elbrian didn't blink. He wanted to scream out that he belonged in this place more than any of them, that he had been here when the foundation of their beloved tavern was that of his own home. He held the words, though, and easily. His years with the elves had given him that control, that discipline. He was here, in Dundalis, in Weedy Meadow, in End of the World, to give the folk some measure of protection that they had never known. If an elven-trained ranger had been about those 7 years before, then Dundalis would not have been sacked, Elbrian believed, and in the face of that responsibility, the surly man's demeanor seemed a minor thing. "The bear will not return," was all the ranger said to them, and he calmly walked away. He heard the grumbling behind him, heard the word strange several times, and not spoken with any affection. They were still planning to go out and hunt the bear, Elbrian realized, but he was determined to get out there first. A black bear had attacked a farmhouse, and that alone was enough of a mystery to force the ranger to investigate. Elbrian was amazed at how easy it was for him to track the bear. The beast had run off from the farmhouse, creating a swath of devastation through the brush, even knocking over small trees, venting a rage that the ranger had never before witnessed in an animal. The tracks were surely those of a medium-sized bear, but Elbrian felt as if he were tracking a Fomorian giant or some other evil, reasoning creature, some creature purposefully bent on destruction. He feared that the bear was in the grip of some disease, perhaps, or was wounded. Whatever the source, with every past scene of utter destruction, the ranger's fear mounted that he would not be able to spare the creature. He had hoped simply to drive the bear far away into the deeper woodlands. He moved up the side of one steep hill, peering intently into every shadow. Bears were not stupid creatures. They had been known to backtrack hunters, taking the men from behind. Elbrian crouched by the side of one tree. He placed his hand on the ground, feeling for subtle vibrations, anything that might offer a hint. He caught a slight movement of a bush out of the corner of his eye. The ranger didn't move except to shift his head to better view the shadow. He noted the wind, noted that he was upwind of the spot. Out came the bear in full charge, roaring. Elbrian shifted to one knee, fitted a heavy arrow, and, with a sigh of complete resignation, let fly. He scored a hit, the arrow skipping off the bear's face and burrowing into its chest, but the bear kept coming. The ranger was amazed at the sheer speed of the thing. He had seen bears in Underblau Innes, had even seen one run off when Jiraviel had banged 2 stones together, but this creature's speed was outrageous, as fast as any horse might run. A second arrow followed the first, diving deep into the bear's shoulder. It bellowed again, and hardly slowed. Elbrian knew that he would not get the third shot away. If it had been a brown bear, he would have taken to the trees, but a black could climb any tree faster than he could. He waited, crouched, as the bear bore down on him. Then, at the last instant, the ranger went into a sidelong roll down the hill. The bear skidded to a stop and turned to follow. When Elbrian rolled to his knees, facing up the hill to the bear, the creature went up onto its hind legs, standing tall and imposing, but leaving some vital areas exposed. Elbrian pulled the bowstring back with all his strength. Hawkwing's 3 feathers were as wide apart as they could go. The ranger hated this business as he sighted the hollow on the bear's breast. And then it was over. Suddenly, the creature rolling, dead. Elbrian went to the corpse. He waited a while to make sure that it would not stir, then moved to its muzzle, lifting its upper lip. He feared that he would find foamy saliva there, an indication of the most wicked disease. If that was the case, then Elbrian would have his work cut out for him indeed, hunting almost day and night for other infected animals, everything from raccoons and weasels to bats. No foe. The ranger breathed a sigh of relief. It was short-lived, though. as Elbrian tried to figure out what, then, had caused this normally docile animal to go so bad. He continued his inspection of the mouth and face, noted that the eyes were clear and not runny, then moved along the bear's torso. He found his answer in the form of 4 barbed darts stuck deep in the bear's rump. He worked one out, not an easy task, and inspected its tip. Elbrian recognized the black, sappy poison, a pain-inducing product of a rare black birch tree. With a growl, the ranger threw the dart to the ground. This was no accident, but a purposeful attack on the bear. The poor beast had been driven mad by pain, and someone, some human most likely given the type of darts, had done it. Elbrian gathered his wits and began his dance of praise to the spirit of the bear, thanking it for its gift of food and warmth. Then he methodically went about skinning and cleaning it. To waste the creature's useful body, to leave the bear to rot or even bury it whole in the ground would, by elven standards, and by Elbrian's, be a complete insult to the bear, and thus to nature. His work was done late that afternoon, but the ranger did not rest, nor did he return to Dundalis to inform the townsfolk of the kill. Someone had brought on this tragedy. Nightbird went hunting again. They were not much more difficult to find than the bear. Their hut, a mere shack of logs and old boards, Elbrian got the distinct impression that many of these had come from the ruins of Dundalis, was at the top of a hill. Branches had been tossed all about for camouflage, but many of these had already withered, their dry and brown leaves a telltale sign. The ranger heard them long before he caught sight of them, laughing and singing terribly off-key, though the voices were surely human, as he had suspected. Elbrian glided stealthily up the hill, tree to tree, shadow to shadow, though he doubted the men inside would have heard him had he been accompanied by 100 villagers and a score of Fomorian giants. He recognized the implements of the trapping hanging all about the shack, along with dozens of drying pelts. These men knew animals, Elbrian understood. In a vat, not far from the back wall of the shack, the ranger found a thick concoction of black liquid, and quickly surmised it to be the same irritant poison that had been used on the bear. The walls of the shack were in bad disrepair, with cracks between every board. Elbrian peeked in. 3 men lay about on piled skins, black bear mostly, drinking foamy beer from old mugs. Every so often, one would shift to the side and dip his mug into a barrel, first brushing away the many flies and bees drawn to the liquid. Elbrian shook his head in disgust, but he reminded himself to keep an eye of respect. These were men of value, strong and heavily armed. One had many daggers within easy grasp, hanging on a bandolier that crisscrossed his chest. Another sported a heavy axe, while the last carried a slender sword. From his vantage point, the ranger noted, too, that a bar was in place across one door. He moved around to the front of the door and took the dagger from his pack. The door did not fit the opening well, leaving a wide crack on one side, wide enough to admit the dagger's blade. A flick of the wrist dislodged the bar, and Elbrian kicked open the door, striding a single step into the shack. The men scrambled, spilling beer, one shouting aloud as he rolled across his sword, the hilt catching hard on his hip. They were up soon enough, Elbrian standing impassively by the door, Hawkwing, its feathered tip and string removed, in his hand, like some unthreatening walking stick. "What do you want?" asked one of the men, a barrel-chested brute whose face was more scar than beard. Except for that hardened face with its wild, untended beard, this man could have passed as a brother of tall Yuganik, Elbrian noted distastefully. Surely their bodies were cut from the same rather large mold. The fellow had his huge axe out in front of him, but if Elbrian couldn't offer a reasonable answer, there was little doubt what he meant to do with it. The swordsman, tall and lean with not a hair anywhere on his head, shadowed the burly man, gaping at Elbrian from over his companion's shoulder, while the third, the skinny, nervous wretch, moved to the far corner, rubbing his fingers, which weren't so far from his many daggers. "I have come to speak with you about a particular bear," Elbrian answered coolly. "What bear?" the burly man replied. "We got skins." "The bear you maddened with poisoned darts," Elbrian answered bluntly. "The bear that destroyed a farm in Dundalis and nearly killed a family." "Go on now," the man spat. "The same poison you have brewing out back," Elbrian went on. "A rare concoction known to few." "That don't prove nothing," the man retorted, snapping his dirty fingers in the air. "Now get out of here, else you'll soon feel the edge of my axe." "I think not," the ranger answered. "There is the matter of compensation, to the farmers and to me for my efforts in hunting the bear." Compen... the tall man stuttered. "Payment," said Elbrian. He saw the movement even as he spoke, the man from the corner drawing and throwing a dagger with practiced ease.
Okay, now it's clean.
Elbrian planted the ball of his left foot and spun clockwise, the dagger flying harmlessly back to stick deep in the wall. The ranger came round as if he would launch a horizontal swipe, but he recognized the move was anticipated. The burly man's axe was up to block. As soon as he started around then, Elbrian turned his right foot out and went around counterclockwise, pulling his hip to avoid a swipe of that axe. Now he launched his attack, dropping down to one knee, slapping his staff across to catch the inside of the overbalanced man's leg. A shift of the angle sent his staff poking straight up, smacking the man's groin. Faster than a cat, Elbrian retracted the staff a foot, shifted its angle, and poked ahead 3 times in rapid succession, prodding the burly man in the hollow of his chest. He fell away, and Elbrian came up hard, bringing Hawkwing horizontal above his head in both hands to catch the downward chop of the second man's sword. Up came the ranger's knee, slamming the man's belly, and as he started to double over, Elbrian turned his staff, deflecting the sword to the side. He twisted his staff around the man's arm, hooking him under the armpit, stepped with his left foot across the body behind the man's entangled side, then heaved with all his strength, launching the wretch into the air to land heavily on his back and the back of his head. Elbrian immediately swung about, realizing he was vulnerable. Predictably, another dagger was on its way, and the ranger just got Hawkwing up in time to block its flight. He loosened his grip on his staff as the dagger connected, so that it wouldn't bounce far away. As fortune would have it, the dagger went straight up, and Elbrian seized it, catching it by the tip. In the blink of an eye, the ranger stood, staff in one hand out before him, his other hand holding a dagger cocked behind his ear, ready to throw. The skinny man, 2 daggers in hand, blanched and let his blades drop to the floor. Elbrian fought hard to restrain the rage that called for him to put that dagger right into the foul man's chest, a rage that only intensified when the ranger thought of what these 3 had done to the bear, and of the potentially devastating consequences of their foolhardy actions. With a growl, he let fly, the dagger slamming hard into the wall right beside the man's head. Never taking his eyes from Elbrian, whimpering all the way, the skinny man slumped to a sitting position in the corner. Elbrian looked about. The other 2 were staggering to their feet, neither holding a weapon. "What are your names?" the ranger demanded. The men looked curiously at one another. "Your names?" "Paulson," the burly man answered. "Crick and Chipmunk," he finished, indicating first the tall man, then the dagger thrower. "Chipmunk?" Elbrian inquired. "Skittery type," Paulson explained. The ranger shook his head. "Know this, Paulson, Crick, and Chipmunk. You share the forest with me. and I will be watching your every move. Another prank, another cruelty, as with the bear, will bring you more harm than this, I promise. And I will be watching your trap lines. No longer shall you use the jaw traps. Paulson started to complain, but Elbrian glared so fiercely at him that he seemed to melt. Nor any other traps that inflict suffering on your prey. We've to earn our money, Chipmunk remarked in a shaky voice. There are better ways, Elbrian answered evenly. And in the hopes that you will find those ways, I demand no coins from you for compensation this time. He looked at each of them, meeting their stares, his own showing clearly that he was not speaking empty threats. And who might you be? Paulson dared to ask. Elbrian shifted back on his heels, considering the question. I am Nightbird, he answered. Crick snickered, but Paulson, locked with that intense gaze, held a hand up to his companion's face. A name you would do well to remember, Elbrian finished, and he headed for the door, boldly turning his back on the dangerous threesome. They didn't begin to entertain any thoughts of attacking. The ranger went around to the back and dumped out the cauldron of poison. As he left, he took a few of the jaw traps, nasty pieces of toothy iron, hinged and set with heavy springs, so that they would clamp hard on the leg of any passing animal. His next stop was the tavern, the Howling Sheila in Dundalis. A dozen men and women were in the common room, boisterous until the stranger entered. Elbrian went to the bar first, nodding to Belster O'Cumley, the closest thing he had to a friend in the area. Just water, the ranger said, and Belster mouthed the predictable words right along with him, then pushed a glass out to him. Word of the bear? The jolly innkeeper asked. The bear is dead, Elbrian replied grimly, and he walked to the far side of the room, taking a seat at the corner table, his back to the wall. He noted that several other patrons shifted their seats, one woman even bluntly turning her back on him. Elbrian brought the tip of his triangular cap down low and smiled. He understood that it would be like this. He was not much like these folk. No longer was he much like any human, except for those rare few who had ventured to the Valley of the Elves, who had spent years beside the likes of Elimar Juravio and Tuntun. Elbrian missed those friends now, even Tuntun. It was true that he had been out of place in Caer Alfar, but in many ways the stranger felt even more out of place here among folk who looked so much like him, but who saw the world through very different eyes. Still, despite the prominent reminders of his position, Elbrian's smile was genuine. He had done well this day, though he regretted having to slay the bear. His solace came in duty, in his vow that this Dundalis and the two neighboring villages would not share the fate that had befallen his own village. He remained in the Howling Sheila for nearly an hour, but not a person, save Belster, on Elbrian's way out, offered him so much as a glance. Chapter 24. The Mad Friar. Tenson, Warder Miklos Barmine said to Jill, as she walked her watch along the sea wall of Pirith Tomb. Jill regarded the short, stout man curiously. She recognized the name Tinson as that of the small hamlet some dozen miles inland from the fortress. The place was no more than a score of houses and a tavern, a place of rogues and whores servicing the soldiers of Pirith Tomb. A waylaid traveller, Barmine added in his typically curt manner. Another fight? Jill asked. And something more, replied the warder, walking away. Gather 10 and go. Jill watched the man depart. She didn't like Miklos Barmine, not at all. He had replaced Constantine Presso only 3 months before, previous warder sent north to command Pt.7. At first, Jill thought the new warder more her style, a stickler for detail and duty. But he was a lech, a drooling, grabby slob who took it personally when Jill refused his advances. Even his strict rules for duty had relaxed within the week, Pt.7 reverting to its typical partying ways. Also, it had surprised Jill how much she missed Constantine Presser. A decent man, by Pt.7's standards at least. She had served under Presser for more than a year, and he had always been a gentleman to her, always respected her decision not to partake in the unending festivities. Now, with Presso gone and the brooding Miklos Barmine in command, Jill feared that the pressure on her would only increase. She shook that dark thought away, turning her attention to the task at hand. Barmine's punishment for her refusal to bed with him was always work. Little did the fool understand that his punishment was more like a reward to Jill. There had been another fight, the fourth in less than 2 weeks, at the Waylaid Traveller, the apparently appropriately named tavern in Tinson. What this something more that Barmine hinted at might be, Jill could not guess, though she suspected it to be nothing extraordinary. The woman shrugged. At least there was something to do now besides walking the wall. She collected 10 of Pt.7's Coast Point guards, using their hangovers as a tool for ejecting more of the others, then set out, double-timing the march down the dirt path. They arrived in dirty Tinson late that afternoon. The town square was empty and quiet. It was always quiet, Jill noted, for on the 3 previous occasions she had visited the place, she hadn't seen a single child. The majority of Tinson's residents slept the day through, preferring the revelry of the night. A shout from the Waylaid Traveller caught Jill's attention. "We must prepare!" came a bellow, a tremendous voice, clear even out here at a distance, and with a wall between the speaker and Jill. "Oh, evil, what a foothold you have found! What fools are we to sleep as darkness rises?" The group of soldiers entered the tavern openly through the front door, doubling the number of patrons. The first thing Jill noticed was a huge, fat man standing atop a table, waving an empty mug, sometimes in a threatening manner to keep at bay the closer patrons, all obviously intent on knocking him from his perch. Jill ordered her troop to filter about, then went to see the man behind the serving bar. "The mad friar," the barkeep explained. "He was in all the night, then came back just a short while ago. There's no shortage of money, I can assure you. They say he bartered jewels with merchants on the road, and though he didn't get a fair price, not even close, he left with pouches full of gold." Jill regarded the fat friar curiously. He wore the thick brown robes of the Abelican church, though they were old and threadbare in many places, and weathered, as if he had been out on the open road for a long, long time. His black beard was thick and bushy, and he was tall, half a foot above 6 feet, and had to weigh near to 300 pounds. His shoulders were wide, his bones thick and solid, but Jill got the feeling that the extra weight, most of which was centered about his belly, was something fairly recent. What struck Jill most about him was his almost feverish intensity, his brown eyes showing a luster, a life beyond anything she had seen in many years. "Piety, dignity, poverty," he yelled, and then he snorted derisively. "Oh, what?" Jill recognized the litany. Piety, dignity, poverty. The same one Abbot Dominion Calislas had uttered on the fateful day of her wedding. "Ha!" the huge man bellowed. "What piety is there in whoring? What dignity and foolhardiness? And what poverty? Gold leaf and jewels? Ah, the jewels!" "His song is not for changing," the barkeep said dryly. Then he yelled out to the guards, "Will you get him down?" Jill wasn't sure that they should move in so straightforward a manner against the friar. The man's remark about whoring, in particular, had seemed to stir more than a few angry grumbles, and she feared that any overt action, a physical assault rather than trying to calm the man, would bring about a general row. She could do little to stop her soldiers, though, given the lax chain of command and the barkeep's permission. She started across the room to try and keep things calm, stopping, though, when she heard the barkeep add, too low for any others to hear, "And take care, for he has a bit of magic about him." "Tom," Jill muttered, turning back to see two of her soldiers, one of them, Gofflaw, reach up to grab the monk. "Ha! Preparedness training!" The fat man howled joyfully, and he grabbed Gofflaw by the wrist and hoisted the surprised man into the air. Before the soldier could begin to react, the powerful friar lifted him above his head, spun him twice, then tossed him across the room. The third soldier drew sword and swiped out one of the table legs, bringing the friar tumbling down atop the poor second man who had been reaching for him. The monk hit the ground in a roll, showing surprising agility for one his size, and came right back to his feet, shouting at the top of his lungs and barreling over the next two closest people, one a soldier, one a townsman. The fight was on in full. The sheer power of the friar astounded Jill. The man ran every which way, bowling over all who would stand before him, laughing maniacally all the while, even when one of those dodging his charge landed a solid punch about his face or neck. "Prepare!" he roared over and over, and he cried something about a dactyl, and then about a demon. Jill watched him for a few moments, honestly intrigued. The man was obviously out of his mind, or at least he appeared so. But to Jill, who had spent a year and a half in the Coast Point Guards, a cry for preparedness and virtue did not seem like such a bad thing. A group of soldiers encircled the friar, one man quickly putting his sword in line and calling for the monk to yield. There came a sudden, sharp flash of blue, and all the soldiers were flying, their hair standing on end. The friar laughed wildly, and he charged on. He rushed to one terrified woman and picked her up by the shoulders. "Do not lay down for them," he cried earnestly, and Jill had the feeling that the man had some personal stake in his plea. "I beg of you, do not, for you are part of the encroachment. Do you not see? You are part of the dactyl's gain." A soldier jumped on the friar from behind, and he was forced to let go of the woman. He merely howled, though, and shrugged the man away, then charged on. Jill cut in front of him. He recognized her as a woman and again slowed and softened his approach. Jill dove at his legs, rolling and sweeping with her own legs, sending the burly friar tumbling headlong. 5 men were atop him in an instant, grabbing and twisting. Somehow, the huge friar managed to get back up to his feet, but more soldiers and several of the townsfolk rushed in, finally subduing him. They ushered the man to the door and unceremoniously threw him out. Jill noted that Gofflaw drew out his sword and moved to follow. "Let him be," she commanded. Gofflaw growled at her, but under Jill's unyielding glare, he replaced his sword in its sheath. "And if you show yourself again," another of the soldiers yelled, "then now you'll feel the bite of a sword." "Hear you the words of truth," the mad friar yelled back at him. "Know me for what I am, and not for the insulting names you give to me. I am the hound of ill omen, the messenger of disaster." "You're a drunk," roared the soldier. The fat man sputtered something unintelligible and turned away, waving his hand dismissively. "You will learn," he promised grimly. "You will learn." Jill turned to the barkeep, the man merely shaking his head. "He's a dangerous one," the man said. Jill nodded, but she wasn't sure she agreed. The fat friar had made no move to finish any of his attacks. He had tackled and punched, had thrown Gofflaw halfway across the room, but no one, not even the friar, had been badly injured. To frustrated Jill's thinking, Gofflaw could use a throw or two across a room. She moved to the door to see the friar shuffling down the muddy lane, weeping and crying out for the sins of men and the woeful state of preparation. He swung about, some score of yards from the tavern entrance, and launched into a diatribe on the coming dark days, about a world unprepared to face the forces of evil, about a darkness being fed by the internal rot of the land. "The man's crazy," one of the soldiers remarked. "The mad friar," the barkeep replied. Jill wasn't so sure of that. Not at all. Chapter 25. Brother Justice. Master Jojona looked down from an inconspicuous balcony at the large chamber, bare of any furnishing but for a few practice riggings sitting against the far wall. In the center of the room stood the stocky young man, his face haggard from lack of sleep. He wore only a loincloth and stood defensively, shoulders hunched, arms crossed to cover his belly and loins. Even his head was bare, for his superiors had shaved it. He uttered a chant repeatedly, using it to bolster his failing strength. And De Unero, the new master who had taken Sayatan's place, stalked about him, occasionally stinging him with a riding crop. Behind Quintor stood a 10th-year immaculate. "You are weak and useless," Deonero screamed, smacking Quintal across the shoulder blades. "And you are part of the conspiracy." Quintal's mouth moved to form the word no, but no sound came forth, managing only a pitiful shake of his head. "You were!" Deonero roared, and he whipped Quintal again. Master Jojona could hardly bear to watch. Quintal's training had been going on for more than a month now, ever since Father Abbot Markwart, looking old and tired indeed, had seen a vision of Avalon alive. Avalon! The very thought of the young brother sent shivers along Jojona's spine. Avalon had killed Sayatan. The body, or what remained of it, had been found only late that spring, almost a year to the day since the tragedy. And worse, if Markwart's vision was true, Avalon had survived and had run off with a substantial supply of the sacred stones. Jojona closed his eyes and remembered all the time Sayatan had warned him about Avalon's almost inhuman dedication. Avalon would be trouble, Sayatan had promised, and the master's words had proven true. But why? Jojona had to wonder. What had precipitated the trouble? A fault of Avalon's, or the man's lack of fault in an order grown perverse? Indeed, Brother Avalon de Briss was trouble, a dark mirror that the masters of St. Mirabel could not bear to gaze into. Avalon, by any measure that Jojona could discern, was what a monk was supposed to be, the truest of the true, and yet his manner could not agree with the increasingly secular ways of the monastery. That the order should be threatened by the piety of a young monk was something Master Jojona could not come to terms with. And yet, the master was too tired, too wrapped up in a sense of loss, both for Sayatan and Avalon, and for himself, to try to make some peace within the monastery. Markwart had become almost feverish in his desire to see Avalon and, more particularly, the sacred stones brought back, and the Father Abbot's word was sacrosanct. The crack of the crop brought Jojona's attention back to the scene at hand. He had never held any love for brutish Quintal, but still he pitied the man. The conditioning ranged from sleep deprivation to long periods of hunger. Quintal's strength, both physical and mental, would be torn away piece by piece, and then brought back under the guidance and control of the training masters. the man would be reduced to an instrument of destruction. Avelin's destruction. Quintal's every thought would be focused on that single purpose. Avelin de Bris would become the source of all his ills, the most hated threat to St. Marabel. Jejona shuddered and walked away, trying hard not to picture the scene when Quintal finally caught up to Avelin. The cave seemed a gigantic caricature of a king's throne room. A huge dais, 3 steps up, centered the back wall, sporting a single obsidian throne that 2 large men could sit in together without touching each other. Twin rows of massive columns, each carved into the likeness of a giant warrior, lined the room. Like the throne, they were formed of obsidian, with graceful but somehow discordant lines swirling about them, like the fibers of interlocking muscles. The floor and walls were clear of the black rock, showing the normal dullish grey of Ada's stone, and the single set of doors was made of bronze. No torches burned within. The room's light, coming from either side of the great dais, where a continual flow of lava issued from the black corner of the wall and descended through holes in the floor, diving down into the tunnels of Ada, then reaching out along the mountain's black arms, engulfing more and more of the Barbican. Small indeed did Uba Banrock and Ulg Tiknan, powery chieftains from the distant Juliance, and Gothra, the Goblin King, seem in that tremendous room. Even Mayor Deck of the Fomorian giants felt small and insignificant, eyeing the statue columns as if they would come alive and surround him, dwarfing his 16-foot height. And Mayor Deck, among the largest of his giant kind, was not accustomed to being dwarfed. Still, even if all 20 of the columns, and a dozen more besides, surrounded the giant, it would not have been more imposing than the single creature reclining on the throne. All 4 of the Dactyl's guests felt that imposing weight keenly. They were each among the most powerful of their respective races, leaders of armies that numbered in the hundreds for the giant, in the thousands for each of the Paris, and in the tens of thousands for the goblin. They were the darkness of Corona, the bringers of misery, and yet they seemed pitiful, groveling things before the great Dactyl, mere shadows of this infinitely darker being. Goblins and giants often aligned, but both races traditionally hated the Powries almost as much as they hated the humans. Except on those occasions when the Dactyl was away. Except at those times when the darker forces bound them together in singular purpose. There could be no struggles for power among the mortal leaders of the various races when the Dactyl sat on its obsidian throne. "We are not for armies," the Dactyl roared at them suddenly, and Gothra nearly fell over from the sheer weight of the resonating voice. "Nor 3, if the Powries consider their respective forces to be allied. We are one army, one force, one purpose." The demon leaped from its throne and tossed a small item, a fabric patch, grey in color, and with the black image of the Dactyl sewn in. "Go out and begin the work on these," the demon ordered. Mayor Deck was the first to inspect the patch. "My warriors are not stitch women," the Fomorian leader began. But as soon as the words left Mayor Deck's mouth, the Dactyl leaped down to stand before the giant and seemed to grow. A feral growl escaped the demon's lips as its hand shot out, slapping the behemoth across the face with enough force to knock Mayor Deck to the floor. Then the Dactyl began a more insidious attack, a mental barrage of images of torture and agony. And Mayor Deck, the proud and strong leader, the strongest mortal creature in all the Barbican, whimpered pitifully and squirmed about on the floor, begging for mercy. "Every soldier in my army shall wear such an emblem," the Dactyl decreed. in my army. And you, the beast said to Meerdek, reaching down and easily lifting the massive giant to its feet, bring to me a score and four of your finest warriors to serve as my house guard. And so the meetings went. Through the days, the demon Dactyl had been awake for several years, watching, feeling every slaughter of humans in the Wilderlands, tasting the blood of every corpse into which a Powry dipped its infamous cap, hearing the screams of sailors and passengers as each scuttled ship went under the swells of the merciless Mirianic. The darkness had grown. The humans had become ever weaker. Now the creature saw the time to organize its forces fully, to begin its unified attack. Terranen Denoniel was dust in the earth. The Dactyl meant to win this time. To the 24 giants Meerdek brought in, the Dactyl presented suits of armor, demon-forged in the twin lava flows of the throne room, full-plated, thick and strong. And the Dactyl made even finer protection for its 4 chieftains, great magical bracers studded with spikes that would protect the wearer from the blows of any weapon. Among the 3 evil races, none had earned any reputation of loyalty or honor. But now, with the bracers, the Dactyl could hold faith that its chosen 4 generals would survive the not unexpected treachery of their underlings. And those ranks were considerable indeed. Outside the cave, on the tree-covered slopes of Ada, thousands of goblins, powries, and giants milled about their respective camps, glancing up the southern face to the gaping hole that marked the main entrance to the demon. All 3 camps were between the mountain's newest arms, 2 black streaks of cooling lava, red-tipped as the stuff continued its slow roll from the bowels of the mountain, reaching out southeast and southwest as if they were extensions of the demon's own reach. There was no sign of tree or brush within those black lines. All life had been snuffed out beneath the darkness, burned away by the fires, and covered by the cooling lava. Even those creatures closest to the center of the area between the arms felt the residual heat, and on that shimmering air was brought the tingles of promised power, the itchy anxiety to go out and kill. All for the Dactyl. What is your name? Punto. The man groaned as the whip struck him again, tearing a red line across his back. Your name? Punto. The whip cracked. You are not Quintor! Deonero screamed in his face. What is your name? Quint. He hadn't even gotten the word out before the whip, handled expertly by the 10th year immaculate, ripped all sounds from his body. Up on the balcony, unseen by the victim and his pair of torturers, Master Jojona sighed and shook his head. This man was tough, admirably so, and Jojona feared he would die from the beatings before he would relinquish his identity. Fear not, came a voice behind him, that of Father Abbot Markward. The treatises do not lie. The technique is proven. Jojona didn't really doubt that. He just wondered why in the name of God such a technique had ever been developed. Desperation breeds dark work, the Father Abbot remarked, coming to Jojona's side, just as the whip cracked again. I find this as distasteful as you do. But what are we to do? Master Sayatan's body confirms our fears. We know the tricks Avlin used to escape, and his cache of magic stones is considerable. Are we to allow him to run free to the detriment, perhaps even the downfall of our order? Of course not, Father Abbot, Master Jojona replied. No living monk in St. Maribel knows Avlin de Briss better than Quintal, Father Abbot Markward continued. He is the perfect choice. As executioner, Jojona thought. As the retriever of what is rightfully ours, the Father Abbot said, reading Jojona's thoughts so clearly that the master turned to regard him closely, Jojona honestly wondering if Markwort was using some magic to peek into his mind. Quintal will serve as an extension of the Church, an instrument of our justice, Father Abbot Markwort said grimly, more determination in his normally quivering old voice than Jojona had ever heard before. The master understood the man's desperation, despite the fact that Avalon's crimes and subsequent desertion were not without precedent. Nor did the stolen stones present any real danger to the Abelican Order. Jojona knew that twice the number Avalon had taken were sold at fairly regular auctions, that the powers of those stones possessed by merchants and noblemen far outweighed the cash Avalon held. The only concern any in St. Mirabel's hierarchy held about the stolen stones was for the giant amethyst crystal, and that only because it was a stone whose magic they had not yet deciphered. So foolish Avalon wasn't really any serious threat to the Abbey or to the Order. But that wasn't the point. Wasn't the source of Father Abbot's desperation. Markwort would be dead soon, taken by that greatest enemy, time. And he did not desire to leave behind any legacy of failure, including the existence of the renegade Avalon. We will put him on Avalon's trail very soon, the Father Abbot remarked. Unless he continues to resist, Master Jojona dared to say. Markwort issued a coughing laugh. Their techniques are proven. The lack of sleep, of food, the rewards and punishments exerted by the eager young masters. Quintal's concepts of right and wrong, of duty and punishment, have been systematically replaced by the tenets given him at times of reward. He is a creature of singular purpose. Pity him, but pity Avalon de Briss even more. With that, Markwort walked away. Jojona watched him go, shuddering at the sheer coldness of the man's aura. His attention was caught by yet another crack of the whip. What is your name? Deonero demanded. The man hesitated. Even from the balcony, Master Jojona sensed they were near a breakthrough. Deonero started to prompt the tortured man again, but he stopped, and Jojona recognized that the young master had seen a change in Quintal's demeanor, a strange light in the man's eyes, perhaps. Jojona leaned over the rail, listening to every inflection, every whisper. Rather justice, the battered man replied. Master Jojona settled back on his heels. He still wasn't wholly convinced that he agreed with the technique or the purpose of Quintal's training, but he had to admit that it seemed effective. Chapter 26. Brad Warden. Is it fear that inspires them? Is it jealousy? Or is it something more sublime, some inner voice telling them that they and I are not of similar ilk? They do not know, of course, of my days with the Tuel Alfar, but certainly it is evident to them, as it is to me, that they and I do not share the same perspective. Elbrian slumped back in the chair, musing over his own words. He put the tips of his fingers together and shifted his hands in front of his face, allowing his gaze to drift from the mirror. When he looked back, the specter of Uncle Martha remained, passively and patiently standing in the mirror's depths. Belimar Joravio warned me that it would be like this, Elbin went on, and, in truth, it seems perfectly logical. Folk of the Wilderlands frontier necessarily huddle together. Their fear isolates them, and they often cannot distinguish friend from foe. So it is concerning me when I venture into the Howling Sheila. They do not understand me, my ways and my knowledge, and most of all, my duty. and thus they fear me. Yes, Uncle Mother, it must be fear, for what have I that the folk of Dundalis should envy? By their measures I am poorer by far. The young man chuckled and ran his hand through his light brown hair. Their measures, he muttered again, and he couldn't help but feel sorry for the folk of Dundalis, of Weedy Meadow and End of the World, huddled ever in their cabins. It was true enough that they enjoyed some amenities Elbrian did not. Soft bedding, solid water basins, stored food. But the ranger had two things far more valuable, by his way of thinking, two things that he would not trade for all the treasures of all the kingdoms of Corona. Freedom and duty, Uncle Mother, he said firmly. I draw no lines of property because those lines serve as barriers both ways. And in the end, it is a sense of accomplishment, of purpose, and not the wealth attained by such accomplishment that equates to fulfillment and happiness. And so I walk my watch, and so I accept the barbs and open chiding. I take faith in what I am doing, in my sense of purpose, for I, above all others, understand the consequence of failure. But I am alone, the young man thought privately, not yet ready to admit the truth aloud. He sat back again for a long moment, then braced his hands on the arms of his chair, preparing to leave. He felt a soft and subtle vibration. Music. He knew it was music, though it seemed too soft, too much in the background for him to actually hear it. Rather, Elbrian felt it in his bones, a gentle, delicate sound, sweet as an elvish harp, melodic as Lady Dasleron's voice. He looked at the mirror, at the distant image, and sensed a calm there. Elbrian went outside his cave immediately, expecting the music to be louder. It wasn't. It hovered on the edge of his perceptions, whatever way he turned. But it was there. Something was there. And Uncle Martha wanted him to find it. He had planned to go to Weedy Meadow that day, then move on with the setting sun to the west, a circuit of End of the World. Now he could not go, for this subtle music, though Elbrian sensed it was not threatening, was surely intriguing. Had the elves come to visit? Then another thought nagged at the young man, a notion that he had heard this song before, though he could not place it. The ranger spent the better part of the morning searching out the direction of the quiet notes. He used all his training, all his tools, focusing his senses one at a time in each direction, on every plant and every animal, seeking some hint of the source. Finally, he came upon a set of tracks. A single, large horse, he decided, unshod and walking at an easy pace. There were indeed wild horses in the area, some perhaps that had escaped the tragedy at Dundalis, others that had run off from caravans, and still others whose roots in the region were older than those of the human settlers. They were not numerous, and surely skittish, though Elbrian had entertained the notion of breaking one. He soon came to believe that this would not be his chance, though, for as he followed the clear trail, he came to the conclusion that he was following, too, the source of the music. Thus, Elbrian believed, the horse was obviously ridden. That thought didn't slow the ranger, it only intrigued him even more. Someone had come into his domain, someone not of the villagers, for if it was one of the villagers, then his horse would likely have been shot. Elbrian skipped down one tree-covered hillside, into a narrow vale, and to the edge of a rushing river. He crossed with some difficulty, but had no trouble regaining the trail on the other side, for the rider was making no effort to conceal his tracks. Elbrian closed steadily. Soon he could make out the actual notes of a wind instrument, he noted, and he searched his memory once again, for he was certain that he had heard that peculiar, haunting sound before. He remembered then the instrument, piped by a merchant on the occasion of Elbrian's 10th birthday. A curious thing, a leather bag, and a series of pipes. A bagpipe, it was appropriately named. The ranger moved swiftly and silently over a series of rolling hills. Then he stopped, suddenly, as the music stopped. Elbrian peered out around a tree. There, standing higher on the hill, amidst a tangled grove of birch and low brush, stood a tall man, much taller than Elbrian, even considering the ranger's deceivingly low perspective. He had black, bushy hair and a tight beard. He was naked, at least from the belly up, with a powerful upper body, muscles clearly defined, and an arched back. He held the pipes under one arm, down low. His song finished. "Well, Ranger, are you liking the way I fill me canter and drones?" he asked, a wide, white smile across his face. Elbrian crouched lower, though he was obviously seen. He could hardly believe that this man had noted his approach, or that this man knew his title. "And it took you long enough to find me," the man bellowed. "Not that you would have, had I not piped for your tracking. And who are you?" the ranger called. "Brad Warden the Piper," the man answered proudly. "Brad Warden the Woodsman. Brad Warden the Pine Father. Brad Warden the Horse Tender. Brad Warden the—" He stopped as Elbrian came out from behind a tree, the ranger rightly sensing that this introduction could go on for some time. "I am called Nightbird," he said, though he figured that this man somehow already knew that. The tall man nodded, smiling still. "Elbrian Wyndon," he added, and Elbrian nodded, then stared dumbfoundedly when he considered the implications of that long-lost name. To everyone in Dundalis, with the exception of Belster Cumley, Elbrian was known only by the name the elves had given to him. "Might be that the animals telled me," Brad Warden remarked. "I'm smarter than I look, not to doubt, and older than you'd guess. Might be the animals, might be the plants." Brad Warden stopped and offered an exaggerated wink that Elbrian, still a fair distance down the hill, saw clearly. "Might be your uncle." The ranger rocked back on his heels, unable to find even the words to ask the obvious questions. He was wary, though not afraid, and he continued up the hill, testing every step before he shifted his weight, as if he expected the place to be trapped. "You should have killed the three," the piper went on. Elbrian shrugged, not understanding. "Paulson and his cronies," the tall man went on. "Nothing but trouble. I'd been thinking of killing them myself when I seen an animal chewing off its leg in one of their wicked catchers." Elbrian started to respond that he had eliminated the cruel traps, but the words were stuck in his throat. As he came around the low brush, he noted the hind quarters of a horse, noted that the man was mounted. As he came around another step, he saw that that was not the case, that the man and no mount had been the source of the tracks. For Elbrian, Nightbird, who had battled Fomorian giants and goblins, who had lived with the elves, the sight of a centaur was not completely unsettling. It brought many questions, though, too many for poor Elbrian to begin to sort out. And it brought, too, a memory of a piping song, while he and Pony had stood quiet on the slope outside of Dundalis. And he recalled, too, the stories of the forest ghost, half man and half horse, that he had enjoyed as a child. "They be nothing but trouble," Brad Warden remarked distastefully. "And I'll kill them if one more scream of me animal friends reaches me ears." Elbrian didn't doubt the claim for a minute. There was something too matter-of-fact about the centaur's tone, something dispassionate, removed from humanity. A shudder coursed the ranger's spine as he imagined what this powerful beast, easily 800 pounds and cunning enough to completely avoid the ranger for all these weeks, might do to Paulson, Crick, and Chipmunk. "Well, Elbrian the Nightbird. Have ye an instrument to join with me pipes? How do you know of me? The ranger demanded. Now, if we're both for asking questions, then we're neither to be getting any answers. Brad Warden scolded. Then you answer mine, the ranger demanded. But I already did, Brad Warden insisted. Might be that you are avoiding the answer, Elbrian interrupted. Ah, me little human laddie, Brad Warden said with that disarming smile, though it surely seemed condescending coming from so far on high. You'd not be wanting me to give up me secrets now, would you? What fun would you have then? Elbrian relaxed and let down his guard. One of his friends had told Brad Warden of him, he figured. One of the elves, most likely Juravio. Either that, Elbrian decided, or the centaur had eavesdropped when the young man was at Oracle, for Brad Warden knew of Uncle Martha and of the little cave. In any case, Elbrian felt in his heart that this was no enemy standing before him, and he thought it more than mere coincidence that this very day, for the first time since he had come to the region, he had hinted openly of his feelings of loneliness. I trampled me a deer this morning, the centaur said suddenly. Come along for a meal then. I'll even let you cook your part. With that, the centaur took up his pipes and started a rousing military march, thundering away on powerful legs. Elbrian ran full out, constantly seeking out shortcuts in the thick underbrush just to keep pace. They were not alike, very different in so many ways. True to his words, Brad Warden allowed Elbrian to start a fire and cook his venison, while the centaur ate his portion, nearly a quarter of the deer, raw. I do hate killing the damn things, the centaur said, ending his sentence with a resounding belch. So cute they be, and appealing to one of me body in more ways than you'd know. But fruits and berries are naught but ticklings. I'm needing meat to fill me belly. He rubbed a hand across his stomach, at the point where his human torso connected with the equine bottom half. And I've considerable belly to fill. Elbrian shook his head and smiled, all the wider when Brad Warden belched again, a great, thunderous burp. You have been in the region all the while? Elbrian asked. And I never spotted you, nor found any sign. Don't you be too hard on yourself, the centaur replied. I've been in the region longer than your father's father was alive. And what might you spot? A hoof print, or me droppings? You'd think them both that of a horse, though if you inspected the droppings a bit more, you'd find that me diet's not quite the same as me horsey friends. And why would I look closer? Elbrian asked, a sour expression on his face. Dirty business, that, Brad Warden agreed. The ranger nodded, forgiving himself for missing the signs. Besides, Brad Warden went on, I knew you were coming, and you didn't know I was here. Unfair advantage, I'd call it, so don't you go chastising yourself. How did you know? A little birdie telled me, the centaur replied. Sweet little thing that says her name twice in a row. Elbrian's face crinkled at the cryptic statement, but he just shook his head, thinking that it really wasn't that important. Even as he started to ask a question in a completely different direction, he remembered a certain friend who fit the description. Tun, he stated, more than asked. Aye, that's the one, Brad Warden laughed. She warned me not to expect too much from you. Indeed, the ranger said dryly. So I told her that I'd be watching over you, the centaur went on. Though I've come to know that you don't need much watching. Then you are elf friend, Elbrian said, hoping to find some common ground. Elf acquaintance, I'd be calling it, the centaur replied. They're a good sort for the wine, and they respect the animals and the trees, but there's too much for giggling and too long on manners. To accentuate his point, he let fly the loudest belch Elbrian had ever heard. Never heard an elf's belly thunder. Bradwarden laughed riotously, then hoisted a huge skin and poured an amber-coloured liquid. Elbrian recognized it as boggle into his mouth, a considerable amount splashing over his bearded face. "You should have killed them," the centaur said suddenly, spraying more than a little wine with each word. Elbrian, thinking Bradwarden to be referring to the elves, crinkled his brow incredulously. "The 3 men I mean," the centaur clarified. "Paulson, Crick, and what's the third then? Weasel?" "Chipmunk." The centaur nodded. "Idiot," he muttered. "You should have killed them, all 3. No respect, I say, and nothing but trouble." "Then why has Bradwarden tolerated them?" Elbrian asked. "They have been in the area for some time, I would guess, considering their lodgings, and obviously you knew of them." The centaur nodded at the simple logic. "I've been thinking of it," he admitted, "but they didn't give me an excuse, and—" he paused and offered a sly wink. "Don't you fear. I am not overly fond of human flesh." "You have tasted it, then?" Elbrian reasoned, not taking the bait. Bradwarden belched again, and then he launched into a long speech about the ills of humankind. Elbrian merely smiled and let the centaur ramble on and on, considering the creature's words carefully so that he could discover many hints about Bradwarden. Elbrian suspected, and would come to confirm over the next few weeks, that he and the centaur were not so different in purpose. He was a ranger, a guardian of the frontier humans, and also of the forest and its creatures. Bradwarden's mission, it seemed, was not so different, except that the centaur was more concerned with the animals, particularly the wild horses. He even hinted that he had given many of the wild horses their freedom, since their human masters treated them badly. He hardly cared for the humans. He had seen the raid on Dundalis years before, he confirmed for Elbrian, though the worst he would admit of the tragedy was that it was a pity. Theirs became a tentative friendship, an offered smile and exchange of news whenever the pair happened to be in the same area. For Elbrian, knowing Bradwarden was a wonderful thing indeed. He found that when he next ventured to Oracle, his previous feelings of loneliness did not follow him into the cave. Chapter 27. The Fat Prophet's Warning. News that she would soon be transferred to Pirith Vanguard, far to the north, did little to change Jill's sullen mood. By all reports, the weather was better on the northern side of the Gulf of Corona, more alive, with brisk winds and a greater change of the season. In Pirith Tomb, even the winter was one long grey sheet of clouds and cold rain, differing from the summer only in terms of temperature. But Jill had settled into a routine here, akin to the continually gloomy season. Each day seemed as the last, an existence of perpetual watch and work. Seconds, minutes, and hours seemed to drag on endlessly, and yet, at the same time, once the weeks had passed, it seemed as if they had flown away. The incident at the waylaid traveller had brought some measure of excitement, some break in the routine. Jill had taken the image of the mad friar back with her, could hear his words still, and found in them a kinship to that which lay in her own heart. There was no sense of duty or honour in Pirith Tomb. None of the Kingsmen or the Coast Point Guards, none in all of Once the Bear, she feared, or in all of wide Corona. And now this man, for speaking the truth with a level of enthusiasm that exceeded even the orgies in Pirith Tomb, this man, who would not be surprised by the tragedy that had touched young Jill's life, who would have expected it and called for preparation against it, this man, this holy prophet, was tagged mad. Jill sighed deeply every time she considered the man who had called himself the Hound of Ill Omen. His words rang so true in her ears, echoing in the quiet lulls between the groans and shrieks that endlessly emanated from the rooms behind her. The mad friar foresaw disaster. Jill only wished that he had sung out his tune in a small frontier village several years ago. Would the people of that village have heeded his warnings? Probably no more than the soldiers of Pt.7, their party resuming from the moment they returned from Tinson. But despite her feelings, Jill kept her vigilant watch, day after day, often long into the night. And she kept her honor and virtue, refusing to give in to the temptations of the celebration, refusing to surrender to the hopelessness. And that was precisely the way Jill viewed the hedonism around her. The soldiers of Pt.7 engaged in the revelry, the pleasures of the flesh, to avoid noticing their empty souls. They had sacrificed their hearts, so to speak, for their loins. So be it. Jill stoically suffered the barbs of her comrades, particularly from Warder Miklos Barmine, who seemed to covet her all the more since she would not give in. Perhaps Pirith Vanguard would be better. She sometimes dared to hope. But, inevitably, her wishes fell back on the dark reality that was life in Hans the Bear in God's year 824. It was a grey morning, no surprise there, with Jill on the wall, seated between crenellations, her legs dangling over the 200-foot drop, her gaze on the dreamy mist that hung over Horseshoe Bay. Pt.7 was especially quiet after a night of tremendous drinking, a night which Jill had spent on the tower roof, quietly tucked under the beam of the fortress's lone catapult, a blanket tight about her. She kept her senses tuned totally to the present, thinking of nothing but the rocky pillars standing like quiet sentinels in the foggy bay, the continual lap of the ebb-tide waves against the rocks so far below, the occasional bleat of a sheep in the sloping field on the other side of the fortress, and of the square sail that was drifting her way through the grey mist. She scrambled to her feet and leaned out over the battlement, peering hard out to sea. It was indeed a sail, moving toward Pt.7, and neither in nor out of the Gulf of Corona. Jill's first instinct was to find some way to warn the obviously wayward craft. The fortress did have a signal barrel, a cask of volatile ingredients, though it hadn't been used in so many years that Jill feared it wouldn't even burn brightly, that was designed for signaling the larger fortress of Kingsman, some dozen miles inland, close beside the catapult. Jill realized that she wouldn't likely rouse enough help to get the barrel up in the air in time, and so she began waving her arms and calling out loudly, warning the ship's crew of the rocks and the impending disaster. How Jill's mouth dropped open in shock when the vessel responded with the swish of its own catapult, a huge rock smashing against the cliff face some 30 feet or so below her. It was exactly the situation for which the young soldier had trained all these years, just as Jill had imagined it might happen, and yet, for some reason, it seemed all too unreal for Jill. She stood there, another long moment, perfectly stunned. She noted then that the vessel was not alone, but was moving in accord with other craft, low to the water. One, at least one, had already gone by Pt.7, making for the beach of Horseshoe Bay, and two flanked the sailing ship on the right, a third on its left. A second ball soared in, this one soaring high over the fortress wall, and over the back wall as well, bouncing down the green field. Jill cried out at the top of her lungs. Then again, a moment later, the ships moving ever closer, when she heard no response. She could see the activity on the deck of the sailing ship now, small forms darting this way and that, tacking hard to put the large caravel between the bay's many sentry stones. She noted their red berets. Poweries, she muttered under her breath. She had no time to wonder where they could have stolen or captured the ship. She cried out again, then turned to view the tower door. There should have been a second sentry there, the relaying voice to the soldiers within. Jill shook her head, her short shock of blonde hair bouncing about. Frustration boiled in the young woman, mingling with desperation. Another shot came thundering in, this one scoring a hit on Pirith Tomb's front wall, taking down some stones. Jill ran along the wall, angling for the door. She noted the bay as she went, saw that the low craft was nearing the beach, and that another was already there, its hatch open, and dozens of red-capped dwarves pouring onto the shell-strewn sand. Yet another shot came in, as Jill grabbed the heavy door's latch and pulled it wide. This missile not of stone, nor pitch, but a jumble of dozens of wide-flying grapnels. "Oh, damn!" she sputtered, seeing many of the hooks gaining a firm hold on the walls. She screamed into the tower then, calling for all hands to the walls, warning of powries in the bay. Then she ran, drawing her sword, cursing at every step. They had been caught unaware. She noted no allies had yet exited the tower, even as she got back to the front wall. Likely half the soldiers either didn't believe that call, or were simply too drunk to heed it, and the other half probably couldn't even find the damned weapons. The ropes were tight from the ship to the wall, with lines of dwarves on each, moving steadily with surprising strength, hanging under, hands and ankles locked about the cord. Jill first tried to dislodge the grapnel, but found that it was too tightly secured, with too much weight on the heavy line. Then she went at the line ferociously, hacking and chopping, chipping her sword from one ill-aimed blow, the blade ringing off the stone wall. The ropes were thick and strong, and Jill knew that she could not cut them all down, could not cut more than one or two down before the evil powries began gaining the wall. "Hurry!" she cried, glancing back to the open tower door. Finally, Miklos Barmine wandered out, rubbing his eyes, blinking repeatedly as if the light, though the day was dim, stung him profoundly. He started to call out to Jill, to ask her what all the shouting was about, but he stopped as he noted the woman at work on the heavy rope. Another man came up behind the warder. "To the walls! To the walls!" Barmine cried desperately, and the man disappeared again into the blackness of the tower, crying out for his comrades. A final hack from Jill sent the rope flying free, half a dozen powries splashing down hard into the cold waters. Jill ran to the next line, but moved right past it, seeing that a dwarf was nearly to the wall some distance down. She got to the spot first, slashing the powry hard as it tried to scramble to the stone. The creature grabbed on stubbornly, but Jill hit it again, right across the face, and it fell away, shrieking to its doom. Jill went to work on the rope. Soldiers were coming from the tower by this point, but powries were coming over the front wall. Jill wasn't halfway through the heavy cord when she had to stop and run to fight another of the dwarves as it pulled itself onto the parapet. The creature drew a small sword, but too late to parry the woman's first savage attack, Jill's sword slashing across the dwarf's eyes, blinding it. The dwarf countered viciously, but Jill had already stepped beside it, then behind it, and when the powry finished its wild swinging, coming back to full defensive posture, Jill locked one arm over its shoulder, her other under its crotch, and lifted and twisted, sending it plummeting from the wall. She didn't even have time to slice once at that particular rope, though, for another dwarf was already running her way, hooting and howling, whipping a cudgel about in the air before it. Charging soldiers met the red-capped dwarves all along the wall, battling fiercely. Jill saw a pair of dwarfs go flying over, saw a man slump to his knees, hands clutching a mortal chest wound. Then she was fighting again, hopping back from the swing of that nasty cudgel. She saw more than a few spikes protruding from its wide end. On she came with a snarl, stabbing straight ahead with her sword. Then, when that attack was neatly deflected, kicking her foot out beneath the sweep of the cudgel, connecting solidly with the dwarf's belly. The powry didn't even flinch, came right back to the offensive with 1, 2, and then a third swiping attack. Jill was backing steadily, but realized that she would soon run out of room, for she sensed that another powry was fast coming in at her back. She started ahead a step, then turned about abruptly, dropping to one knee and lunging ahead, a free hand catching the second dwarf's swinging sword arm, her own sword driving deep into its chest. Jill came up in a short run, bowling the wounded Powry away. Then she pivoted again and came in hard, moving too close for the cudgel to score a solid hit and accepting the weakened blow in exchange for her own attack, a stab into the dwarf's throat. Breathing hard, the woman surveyed the scene. They could not win. The Coast Point guards of Pt.7 were fighting well, but they were badly outnumbered, and they had lost their one advantage: the walls. If they had been prepared, if they had been alert, then most of the Powry lines would have been cut before the dwarves ever gained the wall. If the soldiers had drilled for such an attack, then the defenses would have been coordinated. Then the signal barrel would already be in the air, spinning high and far for reinforcements. Jill did see that a detachment of 6 soldiers was at the catapult, 3 working the levers, 3 desperately trying to hold a handful of Powrys at bay. She should get to them, she realized, but she understood too that there was no chance of that. Fighting was general all along the wall, more and more Powrys pouring in, and another group, those from the 2 barrel boats that had gone into Horseshoe Bay, screaming wildly and charging up the sloping field behind the fortress. Pt.7 was lost. Jill saw Warder Miklos Barmine shouting commands from the wall near the tower. Powrys swarming all about him. He took a vicious hit, then another, but responded with a slash of his own, knocking one Powry from the wall. One of Jill's female comrades came to the tower door then, but she was swept away by a host of bloody caps as they charged in. Barmine continued to scream, though his words soon became but grunts and howls of agony. He was bloodied in a dozen places and took hit after hit, though he stubbornly continued to swing that sword. Then Jill lost sight of him, finding herself facing another dwarf. This one came in hard and, thinking that it had the woman by surprise, launched a wild, sidelong swing. Jill dodged easily, then kicked out behind the flying weapon, just nicking the Powry on the back, but solidly enough so that the overbalanced dwarf fell from the parapet 8 feet to the ground below. Another was quick to take its place, snapping off a series of thrusts with its short sword. Jill managed to glance back toward the tower, saw the host of Powrys flooding in, saw Barmine kneeling, his face, his arms, all his body covered in blood. Spurred by the gruesome sight, she attacked fiercely. Up went her sword, cutting across left to right, then back again, then another strong backhand, each swing sounding with the ring of metal on metal. She shifted her right foot forward with the last stroke, then turned her blade and came straight ahead, driving the Powry back. But another dwarf was behind it to bolster the defense, and another behind that. Jill heard the dying scream of a soldier to her rear, and fully expected that she would soon be overwhelmed. She started forward, then leaped atop the wall, hopping from high point to high point, once over the surprised Powry's stabbing sword. She outdistanced all 3 with a few long strides, moving to the far corner of the front wall. There was yet another rope secured at that point, the last dwarf on it barely 5 feet from the wall. Jill glanced back at the carnage. Many Powrys were down, but more remained, and each of the still-standing soldiers was surrounded, battling desperately. Barmine was kneeling, but offering no resistance, a Powry wiping its beret across his face. Jill winced as the dwarf lifted its cap up high, and in the same motion slammed its spiked cudgel into the dying warder's face. She had seen enough. She could have taken out the dwarf on the rope, but doing so would have allowed the 3 pursuing her to catch her. Jill sheathed her sword instead, pulled her belt off, and leaped out from the wall, beyond the climbing dwarf. She caught the rope with one hand, barely, and hung on with all her strength. 200 feet of empty air below her. The Powry immediately reversed direction, deftly turning about on the rope with sure, strong grips. Its 3 companions, with typical Powry loyalty, went to work at once in the grapnel and rope, caring not at all if they dropped a comrade along with the dangerous woman. Jill had no time for a fight. She kicked out to the side, trying to keep the dwarf at bay, but her main focus was on getting her belt, held fast in her other hand, up over the rope. She looped it up on one try, but lost her grip on the rope and started to tumble. Her free hand somehow caught hold of the other end of the belt. She was holding both ends now, hanging lower, and then she was sliding away from her enemy, sliding fast into the mist, toward the ship, which was holding steady more than 100 feet from shore. The other end of the rope was fixed to the yard of the mainmast. There were many Powries on that deck, though none had as yet spotted her. She figured she'd let go as she came over the prow, in the hope that she would land on deck clear enough for her to roll a few times to absorb the impact. If she could get across the deck to the stern catapult, or more particularly to the cauldrons of pitch and the fire pit near the catapult, then she might be able to cause more than a little havoc. Her plan was moot, as it turned out, for as Jill approached the front of the craft, the rope gave way, and suddenly her descent was much sharper than her forward momentum. She let out a scream, thinking that she would slam headlong into the ship's prow. Luck was with her, and she hit the cold sea short of the ship. She came up sputtering, a mouth full of water, her ears filled with the sound of dying men ringing down from the fortress walls. Anger welled within her, directed at both the Powries and her own comrades. Had they been prepared, this disaster would not have befallen them. Had they heeded their own code of conduct, the Powries would have been repulsed. She had lost her sword in the fall, but Jill didn't care. Feral growls escaped her lips as she started to swim around the vessel, moving all the faster for fear that her limbs would soon be too numb to propel her. She got around to the stern and found the anchor line, a heavy rope down from the port side. Her arms aching from cold and weariness, she grabbed hold and hauled herself up the 10 feet to the rail. She peeked over, even as the catapult fired again, a ball of flaming pitch soaring up over Pirith Tulm's wall. She noted that the missile was far more likely to burn a host of Powries than any human, but the dwarves hardly seemed to care, howling with glee as they loaded the next ball. 3 of them had the ball, cradled in a heavy blanket up above their heads near the basket, when Jill hit them with a flying body block. They fell away toward the taffrail, but could not let go of their load. Over the rail the pitch ball went, taking the 3 Powries with it. The 4th was on Jill in a moment, grabbing for her throat. She couldn't believe the weight of the diminutive thing, nor the strength. In an instant, the Powrie had her on her back and was choking her hard. She tried desperately to break its grip, locked her fingers about its thumbs and turned them outward. She might as well have been pulling against iron shackles. Jill changed tactics and began slugging the dwarf in the face instead, then poking for its eyes. It held on tight and even tried to bite her fingers. Soon Jill's hands were flapping inconsequentially at the Powrie's barrel-like torso, her strength fast deserting her. She would die as Pirith Tulm died, she realized, again silently cursing the unpreparedness, the slovenly men and women to whom she had been forced to entrust her life. She would die, not of any fault of her own, but because the Coast Point guards had grown weak. Her hands flailed wildly. Darkness crept into the edges of her vision. One hand banged against the Powrie's solid waist, against a metal ball above the dwarf's belt. The hilt of a dagger. Jill had struck the dwarf 4 times before it realized that it was being stabbed. With a howl, it finally let go, scrambling about to evade the jabbing dagger. Jill wounded it again, between its flailing arms and right in its chest, and then again, higher, in its throat. The dwarf rolled away, but Jill could hardly move to follow. She lay there for what seemed like minutes, then finally found the strength to come up to her elbows. The Powrie was near the rail, face down. Jill took in another blessed gulp of air and staggered to her feet. She turned to the catapult, its arm low and ready to fire, then looked at the vats of burning pitch, wondering what mischief she might cause. The Powery slammed her hard from behind, driving her into the bent beam. Jill came about, dagger slashing, cutting a line across the dwarf's face, just inches above the garish cut she had put in its throat. The dwarf fell back a couple of steps, but came on again. Jill dropped to her knees and lowered her shoulder, accepting the impact. She curled her legs under her and lifted the dwarf high, stepping fast and shoving with all her strength, putting the creature into the catapult basket. Jill rolled away immediately, falling to the side, grabbing at the release pin and pulling hard. The Powery was almost out of the basket when the catapult fired, launching the dwarf in a wild, spinning flight straight up, arms and legs out wide. Many other dwarves heard the scream, took note of the curious missile, and turned to the stern deck. Jill was out of time. She kicked over the pitch barrels, spilling one onto the capstan that held the anchor line and knocking another down the stairs to the lower main deck. Then she turned to the taffrail, thinking her only escape to be the cold water. Again, sheer luck saved her, for she found a boat hanging from the stern. She had it falling free in an instant. Then, with Powery scrambling up to the stern deck, with fires growing all about her on the capstan and on the catapult, she leaped out as far as she could, taking care to avoid the burning pitch that was floating in the water, and the three dwarves, bobbing low, barely keeping their heads above the waves. They made for the boat, as did Jill, the woman overtaking one and easily dispatching it with her borrowed dagger. Poweries weren't so tough in the water, she noted, as she closed on the second. She swam right by that one, realizing if she delayed, the third would get to the boat before her. She caught that last floundering dwarf, stabbing it hard on the shoulder, then swimming right by it, grabbed desperately for the small craft. A crossbow quarrel skimmed the water right beside her head. Jill worked to get behind the boat, to use it as a barrier against the Powery archers on the deck. She knew that the angle was all wrong, though, that they were too high above her, the boat too close, and that they would get fairly clear shots no matter where she moved. And she knew from the profound numbness that was creeping into her limbs that she had to get out of the water, and quickly. The groan of wood alerted her to the Powery's newest problem. She dared to peer over the small boat's rail and saw that the ship's anchor line had burned through, and the ship, caught on the swell, had swung hard about. Suddenly, the archers had more on their minds than the woman in the water. Jill started to climb into the boat, but had to stop and turn to strike again at the struggling Powery. Finally, she was in the boat, setting the oars, then pulling away with all her strength, the third Powery frantically trying to catch up. It got near enough for Jill to slam it on the head with one of the oars. Chapter 28. Siblings. She dragged herself onto the beach, battered, cold, and angry. She looked back at the small boat, even then being dashed against the rocks, tossed about by the powerful surf. She had drifted all through the rest of that fateful day, all through the night and the better part of the next morning as well. She had meant to go right from the battle to the nearest spot she could find to land the boat, to then run off and find some help, and lead the charge back to Pirith Tool. The Powery ship was barely out of sight when her wounds overtook her, pains and aches she didn't even realize she had suffered. The heat of battle had left her body, and unconsciousness had descended over her like some great hunting bird, wings out wide to block the light of day. She had awakened that night, drifting somewhere in the Gulf, praying that the currents had not pushed her out into the open Mirianic. Luck was with her, though, for the coastline remained in sight, towering black mountains marking the southern horizon. It had taken Jill hours to manage to row the craft near shore, and then to find some place where she could put in. She had settled for a narrow inlet, but as soon as she entered, She found that many sharp rocks were in the water, lurking right below the surface. Jill worked the small boat hard, but understood the futility. So she shed her red Coast Point jacket and her heavy boots, and went over the side, fighting the undertow every inch of the way through the icy water. The rocks took her boat. She didn't recognize any landmarks, but figured she must be somewhere west of Pt.7, on the north coast of the Mantis Arm. Her suspicions were confirmed when she moved inland, found a road, and then, an hour of walking later, a signpost pointing the way 3 miles hence to Macomber. Jill found herself circumventing the town and approaching it from the west, not from the east, the way any stragglers fleeing Pt.7 would. She tried to straighten her still damp clothes, but realized she would be conspicuous indeed to any, walking as she was without boots and without the dirtied, calloused feet of a peasant. And though she was not wearing the telltale red jacket, a woman wearing a simple white shirt, tan pants, and bare feet was not a common sight. Jill wished she had a cloak, at least, to gather closely about her. She got more than a few curious looks from the townsfolk as she passed the fairly sizable settlement of more than 60 buildings, some 2 stories high. Some folk pointed, all whispered. More than a few turned their shoulders and scurried away, and it seemed to the young woman that they were on edge. Perhaps word of the disaster had preceded her. These suspicions were bolstered by the snatches of conversation Jill caught. Words of a contingent of Kingsmen riding hard to the east. She nodded to herself. She should go out and join the force, should go to Pt.7 to avenge. The thought hit Jill like a cold slap. To avenge what? Her comrades? The Lech Miklos barman? Gofflaw, whom she'd imagined killing several times herself. She found a tavern, its sign too worn for her even to make out the name, though the image of a foaming mug was clear enough. Before she entered, a familiar voice, raised in dire warning, assaulted her. "What demons do we invite into our midst?" the man inside cried, and Jill knew, before she saw him, that he was surely standing atop a table, one finger pointed high into the air. She went in expecting a brewing row, but found instead that the mad friar, this time, had a fairly attentive audience. And a large one. There had to be 40 people inside, filling the tavern from wall to wall. Jill sifted through the crowd to get to the bar, started to order a mug of ale, but then realized she had no money. She turned instead, put her elbows on the bar, and watched the monk and, more particularly, the reactions of his audience. She heard whispers of a fight, of goblins, some said, though others more accurately named the enemy Powries. Estimates of the enemy force ranged from 1,000 warriors to 1,000 ships full of warriors. Jill wanted to tell them that it was but one captured sailing vessel and no more than 5 barrel boats, but she kept quiet, fearing to reveal too much of herself, and also thinking it would do these folk good to be afraid. The mad friar apparently shared her feelings, for his speech became more dire, more frantic, as if he envisioned an army of monsters marching down the road right to the border of Macomber. The fever reached a critical point, and then, all of a sudden, it broke. The barkeep came around the bar with a heavy club, moving pointedly for the fat monk. "Enough from you," he warned, waving his weapon. "Whatever happened is the business of the Kingsmen and not the folk of Macomber. All the world must prepare," the fat man retorted, throwing his arms out wide, inviting the people to join. But it was too late. He had pushed past the fear and into the realm of anger. When the barkeep called for assistance, the man found no shortage of volunteers. The mad friar put up a terrific fight, tossing men about, howling about his preparedness training. In the end, though, predictably, the monk was sailing out the door to land unceremoniously in the street. Jill was beside him at once, on one knee as he sorted himself out. He reached into a pocket of his robe and produced a small flask, popping the top and sucking a huge swig. He did well to stifle his belch and looked at Jill, as if embarrassed. "Potion of courage," he explained dryly. "Oh, what?" Jill regarded him sourly, then rose and offered an arm. "You're consistent," she chided. The friar looked at her more closely. He knew he had seen her before, but he could not place her. "Have we met?" he asked finally. "Once," Jill said, "in a place not so far away." "I would not forget so pretty a face," the friar insisted. Jill was too bedraggled to blush, or even to care. "Perhaps if I were still wearing my red jacket," she said, though she could hardly believe she had just admitted her position to this man. He paused for a long moment. Then his face brightened in recognition, and then it darkened immediately as he realized the implications. Your home," he stuttered, as if not knowing which direction to go. "Pirith Tulm." "Never would I call Pirith Tulm my home," Jill retorted. The mad friar started to speak again, but she stopped him with an upraised hand. "I was there," she said grimly. "I saw." "The rumors?" "Powries," she confirmed. "Pirith Tulm is no more." The friar held out his flask, but Jill refused. He nodded and put it back under the folds of his weathered robes, his expression more serious. "Come with me," he bade her. "I have an ear for what you might need to say." Jill considered the offer for a long moment, then moved away with the man to a room he had rented in a small inn on the outskirts of Macomber. He expected her to speak of desertion, but of course her tale, spoken simply and truthfully, was far different. She saw respect mounting in the man's brown eyes, and knew that he was a friend, knew that he would not turn her into the military authorities, that he held as little respect for them as did she. When she finished, when she explained that she was glad again to hear his voice and could now appreciate his dire warnings, the friar smiled comfortingly and put his hand over hers. "I am Brother Evelyn de Bris, formerly of St. Mirabel," he confided, and Jill understood she was probably the first person he had told his true name in a long, long time. "It would seem that we are both dispossessed." "Disappointed would be a better word," Jill replied. A dark cloud passed over Evelyn's face. He nodded. "Disappointed indeed," he said softly. "I have told you my tale," Jill prompted. It came out in a burst of emotion Evelyn had not known since that night he had cried for his dead mother. He told Jill much, more than he would have ever believed he could confide, holding back only the specifics of the ringstones, the secret island, the method and fatal result of his escape, and the fact that he carried with him the stolen cache of powerful magic. Those things did not seem paramount to Evelyn, anyway. Not when weighed against the tragedy of the Windrunner, the loss of his dear Dansali Comowick. "She told you her name," Jill put in quietly, and Evelyn's brown eyes misted at the realization that this woman could understand the significance of that. "But you have not," Evelyn said to her. "Jill," she answered, after a short hesitation. "Jill?" "Just Jill," she assured him. "Well, just Jill," Brother Evelyn said with a widening smile. "It would seem we are two lost lambs." "Yes, mad Brother Evelyn de Bris," she replied in the same sing-song voice. "Two lost lambs in a forest of wolves." "Pity the wolves, then," Evelyn cried. "Oh, what?" They shared laughter, a relief of tension both of them so desperately needed. Jill for her recent trials, and Evelyn because he had spoken openly at last of his dark past, had relit the candles about those desperate images and feelings that had driven him out on the road. Piety, dignity, Poverty, the monk said distastefully when he had caught his breath. The credo of the Abelican Church, Jill replied. The lie, Avlin retorted. I saw little piety beyond simple rituals, found little dignity in murder, and poverty is not a thing the masters of St. Mary celebrate. He gave a snort, but Jill knew she had him beaten on this point. Ever vigilant, ever watchful, she recited dryly, and Avlin recognized her words as the motto of the Coast Point Guards. Tell that to the Poweries. They laughed again, all the louder, using the very sound of mirth as a shield against tears. Jill spent the night in Avlin's room, the monk, of course, acting the part of a perfect gentleman. He considered the tale he had told her, his life story, and then looked to regard himself, the extra £100, the battered appearance. Ah, Jill, he lamented, you should have seen me in my idealistic youth. What a different man I was then, before I saw the terrible truth of the world. His thoughts hung on those words for a long, long while, and then it struck him that if he were to truly call this woman his friend, he would have to search hard for a part of himself that he had thought long ago. To be a friend to Jill, to be a proper companion to anyone, would mean recovering some of that idealism, some of that belief that the world was not so dark and terrible, and that, with effort, it might even get better. Yes, the monk whispered over the sleeping woman. We'll find our way together. The next morning, they purchased some supplies, including a short sword, boots, and a warm cloak for Jill. And then they walked out of Macomba together, down the road to the west, ignoring the stares and whispers, feeling somehow as if they shared a secret and a wisdom the rest of the world, fools all, could never comprehend. That bond alone held Jill together with Brother Avlin over the first weeks of their journey. They were siblings, Avlin insisted, two alone against the encroaching darkness. Jill accepted a large part of that argument, but hardly considered herself brother to the mad friar. The man drank almost constantly, and whatever town they entered, Avlin found some way to get into a fight, often brutal. So it was in the town of Dewsbury, along the Masur Delaval, halfway between Amvoy and Ursel. Avlin was in the tavern, as usual, standing atop a table, spouting warnings and curses. Jill came in just as the fight broke out. 24 men swinging at the closest body, not bothering to ask if it was enemy or ally. In these general rows, as opposed to the occasions when all the bar teamed up against the monk, Avlin more than held his ground. The huge bear of a man tossed his attackers with ease, punched and twisted deftly, hollering, "Oh, what?" every time he felled another. Jill came in, hard and fast, simply to defend herself as she made her way to her comrade. She, too, could handle the drunken townsfolk without much effort, turning easily as one man lunged for her, walking right past his lumbering leech, then kicking back hard on his instep, sending him down to the floor. "Must you always?" she asked, when she at last reached Avlin's side. The monk replied with a wide grin. Then he quickly brushed Jill aside with his right hand, straightening the man who was charging in at her back with a stiff left jab, then knocking him flying with a heavy right cross. "Ho, what?" Avlin boomed. "The town will be better for it." He started away, but Jill kicked him hard in the rump. He turned to her, wounded emotionally at least, but she would not back down, pointing resolutely at the door. It wasn't until they had exited the tavern, the fight raging still, that Avlin suddenly stopped and looked at his beautiful companion, a most curious expression on his face. Not even blinking, he reached under his robes, then quickly retracted his hand. It was covered in blood. "My dear Jill," Avlin said, I do believe I have been stabbed. His leg started to buckle under him, but Jill caught him and guided him off the main road to a porch in a nearby alley. She thought to leave him there, to run off and find Dewsbury's healer. Every small town had one. But Evelyn caught her by the arm and would not let her go. Then she saw it. Brother Evelyn produced a greyish-black stone, its polish so deep that it seemed almost liquid, so smooth that Jill felt as if she could slip right into it. Her gaze lingered on the stone for a long while, the young woman sensing there was something extraordinary, something magical about it. I need to borrow some of your strength, my friend, Evelyn said, else I shall soon perish. Jill, on her knees before him, nodded, eager to help in any way. Evelyn wasn't satisfied with that response, though, fearing that Jill did not understand the true measure of what he needed from her. We shall become one, he said, his voice growing ever more breathless, more intimate than anything you have ever known. Are you prepared for such a joining? I hardly think you are in condition. Not physically, oh no, not that, Evelyn quickly corrected, wheezing out a laugh despite his obvious agony. Spiritually. Jill rocked back on her heels, regarding Evelyn curiously. A physical union she could not abide. Not with this man, not with Connor. But this cryptic talk of a spiritual joining did not seem so imposing. Do what you must, she begged. Evelyn regarded her a while longer, then finally nodded. He closed his eyes and began chanting softly, falling into the magic of the powerful hematite. Jill likewise closed her eyes, listening to the inflections of the chant. Soon, she no longer heard them, but rather felt them, as if they were emanating from within her own body. And then she felt the intrusion, the spirit of Evelyn making its way into her. Just his body was there, she realized, as again his spirit sought entry. Jill tried to break down her defenses, knew logically that if she did not let Evelyn have his way, he would surely die. She knew, too, that she had come to trust this man. He was a friend, of like mind and, on most points, morals. She focused all her strength, trying vainly to invite the man in, trying vainly to facilitate the joining. Then she was screaming, not aloud, or perhaps aloud, she was too consumed to know. Evelyn came closer, so much closer, too close. They seemed to be as one. Jill caught images of the brown and grey walls of a monastery, of an island coveted with lush vegetation and trees with wide-fingered branches. Then she felt as if she was falling, looking into the face of a hawkish man who was falling beside her. And then she felt the pain of a stab wound, sharp and hot. It was not on her, she knew that, but it was right there beside her, pulling at her life force, sucking her into its depths. She resisted, tried to push Evelyn away, but it was too late now. They were joined, and the monk fed as a vampire would feed. Jill's eyes popped wide in horror, and she jumped, startled to find that the monk was still reclining in front of her. The pain became another sensation, hot and private, too private and yet shared. Jill instinctively recoiled, but she had nowhere to hide. She had let Evelyn in, and now she must suffer the experience. For Evelyn, the union of spirits proved something wondrous. Even as he explored this unfamiliar use of hematite, he gave to Jill his understanding of the stones. And it was so easy. He felt her response immediately, Jill passing her energy through the hematite into Evelyn's wounded body as smoothly as any fifth-year student of St. Maribel. It struck Evelyn profoundly, then, that the monks might be teaching the usage of the stones in a terribly wrong manner. That if the instruction came in the spiritual mode, through the use of hematite, the students might progress much faster. Jill, he knew, would come away from this with more than a casual understanding of how to use the magic stones. And she was strong. Evelyn felt that. With practice and more joinings, she could quickly rival all but the powerful stone users of St. Maribel, and all because of this simple technique. But dark images began to wash over Evelyn. Scenes of men running amok with stone power. He dismissed the notion of training stone use through this method as quickly as he had entertained it, for he realized that the discipline involved in handling such power could not be taught in any easy way. Suddenly he felt guilty for what he had just given this woman he hardly knew, felt as if he had somehow betrayed God, giving a blessing without first asking for any guidance or sacrifice. It was over in a few moments, with Evelyn back in his nearly healed body. Jill turned away, could not look upon the man. "I am sorry," Evelyn said to her, his voice weary, but all trace of physical pain gone. "You have saved my life." Jill fought away the black wings of her past, the barrier that had for so long protected her against intimacy, the barrier that Evelyn had not crashed through, but had somehow circumvented. With great effort, she managed to turn back and face him. He was sitting upright now, smiling sheepishly, the cloud of pain and death gone from his plump features. He started to apologize again, but Jill put a finger over his lips to silence him. She stood up and offered her hand, helping the portly monk to his feet. Then Jill started down the road, like all the other roads that led them out of all the other towns. She offered not a word as they walked long into the night, replaying those terrible moments of their joining over and over in her mind, constantly telling herself that it had been necessary, and trying to fathom the images that Evelyn had given her. Images, no doubt, from the monk's past. There was something else, though, some gift that Evelyn had left behind. Jill had never even heard of the magic stones before, let alone used one, but now she felt as if she could handle them fairly well, as if their secrets had been unlocked to her in the blink of an eye. On this point, as well, she kept quiet, not knowing yet whether Evelyn had given her a gift or a curse. Evelyn, too, did nothing to break the silence. He, too, had much to contemplate, the feelings he had viewed within the tortured woman, and the scenes that the joining had shown him. Images of a slaughter in a small town, probably somewhere in or near the wilder lands. And Evelyn had a name for the place, a name the woman could not remember. He inquired privately about it in the next town the pair ventured through, and then, as the monk gained more and more knowledge, he began to steer Jill, generally, north. It was with mixed feelings that Jill followed Father Evelyn into Palmares. The woman desperately wanted to seek out Gravis and Petitbois, to tell them she was all right, to hug them and fall comfortably onto Petitbois' soft bosom. All of that was, of course, tempered by her realization that she was, in effect, a deserter. A meeting with Connor could prove disastrous, and if Grady happened to spot her or learn of her visit, the greedy man would likely set the Kingsman on her trail, if for no other reason than to ensure his inheritance. Jill did go out one night, while Evelyn went down into the common room of the inn they had chosen, spouting his diatribes. She made her way silently across town, taking up a spot in the alleyway across from Fellowship Way. She sat there as the minutes became an hour, taking some comfort in the fact that many patrons came and went. Apparently, her little disaster hadn't ruined the Chili Chunk name. Sometime later, Petitbois came out of the inn, rubbing her hands on her apron, wiping the sweat from her brow, smiling, always smiling, as she went about the business of her life. Jill's heart tugged at her to go out and embrace the woman, to run to Petit-Bois as she would have run to her natural mother. Something within, fear for Petit-Bois perhaps, stopped her though. And then, quickly, the plump woman was gone, back into the bustle of the way. Jill left the alley hurriedly, thinking to go back to her room across town. Somehow, she wound up on the back roof of the way, in her private spot, basking one final time in those familiar feelings. Up here, she was, in effect, in Petit-Bois' arms. Up here, Jill was cast astray again, a younger girl in a world less complicated, with feelings less confusing. She spent all night watching the stars, the gentle drift of Sheila, the occasional lazy cloud. She returned to her room as dawn was breaking over Palmares, to find Avlon snoring loudly, his breath smelling of ale and more potent drinks. One eye blackened. They remained in Palmares, a city large enough to suffer the likes of the Mad Friar, for several more days, but Jill never ventured near Fellowship Way again. Chapter 29. Of Singular Purpose. They gave him but 2 stones, a smooth yellow-hued sunstone and a cabochon garnet, a carbuncle of the deepest shade of red. The former, among the most valued stones at St. Mirabel, could protect the man from almost any stone magic, could kill all magic in an entire area, and render all spells useless within it. And the latter, the Seeking Stone, could show him the way to magic. Thus was Brother Justice equipped to find and destroy Avlon. He set out from the abbey one dark and dreary morning, riding an ash-grey mare, not swift of hoof, but long in heart. The horse could go for many hours, and Brother Justice, so focused on the completion of his vital task, pushed her to her limits. He travelled first to Humanef, the village where Avlon de Bris had been born, some 300 miles from St. Mirabel. He went to the small cemetery on the hill outside the place first, found the stone raised in memory of Annalisa de Bris, and noted with some satisfaction that the name of Jason de Bris had not been added. "Have you come to tell me of my son Avlon?" the old man asked, as soon as Brother Justice, his brown robes marking him as an Abelican monk, knocked at his door. The simple question, asked so very sincerely, put the monk on edge. "Is he dead?" Jason asked fearfully. "Should he be?" Brother Justice retorted. The old man blinked many times, then shook his head. "Forgive my lack of manners." He bade the visitor, moving to the side of the door and sweeping his hand, an invitation for the monk to enter. Brother Justice did so, his head bowed to hide his cruel smile. "I'd only assumed that a visit from a man of St. Mirabel would be to give tidings of Avlon," Jason explained. "And since the visit was not from Avlon—" "Where is Avlon?" The monk's tone was flat and cold, a snapping question that sent Jason back on his heels and had the hair on his neck standing on end. "You would know better than I," the old man replied quietly. "Is he not at the monastery?" "You know of his long journey?" the monk asked sharply. Jason shook his head, and Brother Justice sensed that he was truly confused. "I last saw my son in the fall of God's year 816, Jason explained, "when I handed him into the care of St. Mirabel, into the arms of God." Brother Justice found he believed every word, and the fact only made him all the more angry. He had hoped for information from Jason de Bris, a direction to take that he might end this foul business quickly and efficiently. But Avlon had apparently not come home, or at least had not made contact with his father. Now the monk was torn, not knowing whether he should kill the old man erasing any trace of his pursuit of Evelyn should he come home, or simply brush away any sense of misgivings Jason might hold, putting the visitor in a more congenial light. That would not work, Brother Justice realized. For if Evelyn did come home and learn of a visit from the monk, then he would know that this had been no social call. Still, to slay the old man might make things even more complicated, for then he would be marked by the local officials and perhaps even hunted. There was one other way. I fear to tell you that your son is dead, he said with as much conviction as he could muster, and that was not considerable. Jason leaned heavily on a table and seemed suddenly very much older indeed. He fell from the Abbey walls, Brother Justice went on, into All Saints' Bay. We have not recovered his body. Then why did you come here with questions as to his whereabouts?
All right, everyone. I'm going to call into his life for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by. Everyone keeps stopping by. Until next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe.